I'm a huge fan of She-Ra, and while I love so many of the characters, there's some I don't like nearly as much as others. One particular character I have a major bone to pick with is Double Trouble. To be clear, before I get into things, a quick disclaimer, what I'm about to discuss isn't something that I'm worried about, but felt like it could add to the conversation of good representation. But that might not matter because I had like a 10-minute disclaimer in front of my Lily Orchard video, and that didn't do anything. But anyways, I like Double Trouble as a character. They're fun, charming, creative, and the way they impact the show so deeply is underappreciated, and the character design is brilliant. I love it. I really like Double Trouble. They look really cool. Their personality is super fun. Lots of jokes. It's just comedy gold. I like the design. I like the voice. I like the behavior. That's always interesting. However, we're talking about She-Ra, a show with a cast of characters so broad and deep, a show that tried to capture the essence of everybody. It's kind of hard to do things 100% right all the time, and despite She-Ra being good, I feel like Double Trouble is one of the writing staff's few failures. As far as She-Ra's Netflix Representation Matters collection goes, She-Ra is one for the history books, and even in the early 2000s with the Power Rangers and Magic School Bus just kind of weaving in representation so people in my generation, and this just looks normal. The group of princesses all just being so diverse, but even despite people's efforts over the past couple decades, She-Ra still has some of the most representation among all of the things. It's not a competition, but if we're parading this show around as like a beacon of representation, then it will fall under more scrutiny than the likes of recent Disney slot because we're expecting a certain level of thought and care in order to justify such high praise for the show. I think Double Trouble is one of the few characters who fails to measure up to the rest of the cast. I do want to point out that all the characters are so good that anybody that is good but not brilliant will just look worse by comparison because the show is already chock full of such great stuff. I've made a ton of She-Ra videos about the characters. I love it. I love all the characters. Well, almost all of them. Double Trouble's one that I don't love, which is that I'm making this video because I think Double Trouble is very problematic for a number of reasons. I do want to say that despite me having an issue with Double Trouble's representation, the character is a ton of fun. I really like them. I think the show could have used more of them. I have a very special gripe with Double Trouble, and I want to see how you feel about it because it's leaving me feeling really dour, so I'm hoping we can come up with some good ideas for the future or enlighten me on aspects I'm missing. If you're interested in media representation deep dive, subscribe to my channel for more. As for the villain we're questioning today, a brief synopsis of Double Trouble, just in case you need your memory jogged, or maybe you clicked on this because you're like, oh, non-binary representation. I'm interested in that. Who is this character? Double Trouble is an anthropomorphic chameleon actor. Unfortunately, being an actor doesn't pay that well in the homeworld of Etheria, so they kind of do part-time asshole to get by. By that I just mean they're a saboteur. After seeking employment from Catra and substantially impressing her to get payroll, Double Trouble works for Catra throughout season 4 of She-Ra until captured by the Princess Alliance towards the season's end. Eventually, Double Trouble finds it to be in their best interest to work for Queen Glimmer of Bright Moon and betray the Horde. Double Trouble then briefly appears in season 5, however, not much notable happens aside from them just generally being fun on screen, but that's about it. Since Double Trouble is portrayed as a melodramatic theater person similar to Adrian from the Owl House, there's a particular emphasis on how one trains to prepare for a specific role. I believe during a live stream, Nate Stevenson, the creator of She-Ra, was discussing how Double Trouble prepared themselves for the role of Flutterina, who, if you've seen season 4, you'll know Flutterina was the alter ego and disguise that Double Trouble used to infiltrate the Princess Alliance. I unfortunately do not have the live stream or the events of this controversy, so I'll just have to relay it to you. The reason why I bring this up is if there's something negative about Double Trouble, people will kind of use that to try to paint the whole group of non-binary and queer people as an issue. Nate allegedly said something along the lines of, Double Trouble followed kids around to study their behavior in order to figure out what childish behavior looks like, which would therefore allow themselves to better act that role as Flutterina and be perceived as a little kid. And that, you know, would enable them to sneak into Bright Moon a lot easier. There seems to be a plot hole as to why the Glimmer Group allowed a child to join them in combat and be part of war room discussions, but that's also just besides the point of the representation thing. But it is funny to point out how the team is just dropping the ball here. I don't think a kid should be involved in war. Think about it like this, even the Horde waited till all the cadets were adults to send them off to war. They're like, okay, you're not 18, you're not actually going to stab anybody. yet. But once you hit 18, you certainly will. Back to Double Trouble. Somebody attributed the stereotype that queer people are creepy child lovers and claimed that this backstory for Double Trouble, learning how to become Flutterina, painted all queer people in a bad light, which I can see it. You can have your own opinion. I understand that. However, I personally find this to be a vapid assertion because queer people are fighting for equal rights and representation. Anybody who asserts that queer people are all child molesters are unserious people, not worth anyone's time and energy. So we shouldn't even be putting any idea into this criticism at all. I think the weirdest interesting part is it seems like it's coming from people within the queer community who are made this assertion, and you don't go around calling your own people diddlers or trying to play into these stereotypes. This is unacceptable. The second piece of criticism is Double Trouble follows the trickster archetype. This reinforces the belief that all trans and non-binary people are simply trying to fool you. Obviously, you can see by how I'm laughing in the middle of it, I can't take this seriously because, I mean, people love Loki, especially queer people. He is the fundamental trickster archetype. The dude even turned into a girl and got pregnant once. Also, a lot of people just like the power because being able to just change your appearance to however you would like it to be is just so convenient for trans people. Like, hello? There wouldn't even be any question. I think Double Trouble honestly just plays into a queer power fantasy by giving them this specific superpower, so I think it actually appeals really well to queer people. However, this argument does make a little bit of sense because the previous one was learning from kids equals pedophile, and this one is a character using their transness to do evil things, which I can kind of understand why this would be worrisome, even though I just expressed that, like, I have a fundamentally different idea on the situation. However, the majority of Double Trouble's trickster arc stems from their shape-shifting abilities that enable them to live their life as a spy. Meanwhile, Perfuma is trans, and she's a fucking flower girl. If the show wanted to paint trans people in a bad light, Perfuma would also be really not good. Obviously, trans representation is really hard to do, especially when there's so much scrutiny, and everybody has their own opinions. So if you don't like the fact that Double Trouble's a trickster, and you still want that trans representation, I hope that Perfuma accommodates that interest. And with Perfuma being so wholesome, I just disagree with the writers having Double Trouble potentially be a PR issue this way. Characters with shape-shifting powers always do spy shenanigans stuff. Double Trouble's just also doing that because they have that power. Just because they're trans, I get that it hits different, but Beetlejuice is a trickster archetype too, but he says some deeply misogynistic things. That doesn't reflect poorly on men just because Beetlejuice, same with Double Trouble and non-binary people. The trickster arc doesn't reflect on the group of people that they represent. This is just a type of media that is designed a certain way for people to enjoy. And if you don't enjoy it, that's fine. You could not like the character. I really like Double Trouble, but I think as far as representation goes, it's horrible. I don't think this is even an issue because tricksters be trickstering. That's not a saying. Now, if you don't know or need a refresher, non-binary basically means you don't classify yourself within the social confines of man or woman. This is different from agender, which basically means exclusion. I don't really care about the genders. Is the agender be like, from my understanding? Non-binary would fall somewhere in between male and female. And since it's a spectrum, you can kind of infer that most genders are some form of non-binary. Like I said, agender and gender fluid, they're both denominations of non-binary. Gender fluid, you just slide along that spectrum to as you see fit, as you would like to express yourself, and that fits kind of under non-binary because you're kind of going against gender norms by doing whatever you want instead of trying to fit rigidly into one end or the other. If you're struggling to grasp these concepts, it's okay. I live in the sphere, so I'm kind of like, I find it pretty easy to pick up. However, just know that there is tall, beard, works out every day guy, and then there's also like long hair, dresses, makeup, nails, and non-binary would be sliding around in the middle of those features. Think androgyny, but that's kind of an issue as well. We'll get more into that later in this video to explain it some more. That's one of the main gripes that I have with Double Trouble. And now we get into my favorite part, the Jacobtopia controversy. Oh boy, here we go. There's been some discussion in the past about a character who is trans should be played by a trans actor, because trans people are discriminated against constantly, and if you take away jobs that they could perform and give it to a cis person, trans people are continually suppressed. I kind of disagree with this to an extent. I do understand from the perspective of trans people are treated as an inferior class of people by society, and if you can at least cut out this little slice for them, then that guarantees some acting employment for them, so that way they can have that life. However, I just feel like most trans people should just be able to go for whatever role they want. I think some remakes recently have had this issue with like the Ariel and basically like the blackwashing recently in Disney. It's kind of like if this actor did have the best performance and you're like, wow, I don't care that they're not a white ginger. They're really good, and I think that they will elevate the movie. So let's roll with them. That is really good, and it should be taken the same way with like trans people. It's like, wow, they perform this thing really well. We appreciate their acting skills. You can't go, oh, well, you're trans, so you don't get to play a cis person. Oh, you're black, you don't get to play a white girl. Bye. I know some chuds would use this to be like, oh, if you can change your gender, why can't you change your race? I identify as white. But that's kind of like the issue with race and gender is something that society forces upon you. Be like, you have this, so that way you must behave this way, and we will punish you for not doing it and then reward you for giving into it. And then that's just not what people want, so then they're alienated and treated worse by society. Meanwhile, race usually dictates your culture. People who grew up in a black neighborhood versus a white neighborhood, it is a very different experience. If you grew up in a Mormon church or like in a synagogue, there's just different cultural differences. And we had this issue with the one dude who really wanted to be Korean because he just liked Korean culture so much and was doing all the plastic surgeries to make his face look more Korean, which, yikes. But it's kind of just like you can appreciate a culture, and that is one of the biggest defining factors between races and whatnot. So it's kind of a weird thing to get hung up about. But yeah, I just want to set the stage and be like, hey, this is the difference between like transracial and transgender. They are completely different things. It's like you can appreciate this other thing, but like if you're a black person and you go to a rodeo and go tailgating, nobody's gonna look at you weird. But if you're a guy and you put on makeup and have long nails, people will look at you weird, because one of them is just doing a culture that's not in your vicinity, and one of them is defying the expectations of people around you regarding your appearance. But either way, to bring this back to Jacobtopia, they are a non-binary person. Trans femme, non-binary, I think is the classification I go with, because I feel like that's what I would fall under as well. But yeah, they're non-binary. They voice a non-binary character. This is fine. I don't see an issue with this. However, a lot of people look at Double Trouble and they're like, this is trans representation. Jacobtopia is trans, which I know not all non-binary people identify with the trans label. If we go by definition, trans just means you no longer associate with the gender that you were assigned at birth. So therefore, all non-binary people are technically trans. As somebody who suffers with a lot of gender dysphoria, I relate to this. So it's like, okay, I say I use it pronouns, they, them. I identify with the dysphoria aspect. I would say, like, yeah, I definitely use the trans label because I feel like that better encapsulates my experience with dysphoria, as opposed to just not liking the concept of gender. Therefore, I don't associate with one. I don't know if the same is true for Jacobtopia, because if we take a look at their Instagram, they just look like a trans caricature, and this is what people have an issue with over Jacobtopia. You have somebody who represents a trans person in media, but then if you go investigate this person, like, they look like they're mocking the trans community with their existence. So I understand when people are really uncomfortable that somebody who is basically used in like Ben Shapiro admircials to be like, fuck trans people. It's I understand where that fear is coming from. However, we're all fighting for equal rights and equal ability to express ourselves. We don't get to shunt this person down and be like, you don't deserve this job because you don't fit into our idea of what a trans person should look and act like. Because then we circle back to like transphobia again, because like, what, how dare you not fit into this gender archetype? That's kind of the whole point of being trans, is so you can be yourself and not have to worry about the gender archetypes. And if you want to fit into them, you can, but you certainly don't have to. And that's one of the reasons why Jacobtopia uses the non-binary label instead of trans woman label. Just because they're trans femme, that just means they have to feminize themselves to better portray how they would like to portray themselves. It connotes a kind of experience, like a trans mask and trans femme. They were socialized differently by society, so there's ingrained behaviors that are unique to them, and then they have to learn behaviors of their gender because they didn't grow up with those, and that's going to shape them differently. So not all trans people are the same, and some people like to transition to different extents than others. So this is just merely comes back to the idea of, we live in fucking America, we have freedom, let people be free to do and behave how they like as long as they're not hurting anybody. So while I understand how you look at Jacobtopia and go, this just looks like a trans character, it makes the entire trans people look bad, you can't fight for your freedom to express yourself while not allowing them to express themselves and what labels they use. Now, my reason for not liking Double Trouble and thinking that they're bad representation is the fact that they're too androgynous. I personally really enjoy the aesthetic of something that looks like it could be a man or a woman. But most non-binary people I know or follow online, they don't fit perfectly in between the gender representations. They just look like a dude or look like a girl, and because of their dysphoria, they don't like to identify with these labels, or because they don't like the concepts of gender and the society that has been built around it, they choose to not use the pronouns as like defiance towards it. This is most non-binary people in my experience. So to have Double Trouble be the non-binary representation and to be androgynous, I think is a really bad standard to set, because now we're kind of boxing people into, hey, if you're non-binary, you kind of need to look like you could be one or the other, which is really unfair. There's just too many issues with androgyny. While I like androgyny, and that's something I aim to achieve, it is not something I want for non-binary people. It can be an option, but being non-binary and being androgynous should not be synonymous. Like if you've seen the Owl House Season 3, Luz, we see Luz embrace a little bit more of a tomboy aesthetic. That's what like a lot of non-binary people look like. That's just much more relatable non-binary representation. If instead Luz was like, I'm not bi, I am a non-binary, then that would be perfect sense. It just looks like people I know, and it's just exciting to see some of the most real representation, but they're like, no, Luz isn't non-binary, they're bisexual. It's like, that's also fine. If you enjoyed Double Trouble, that's okay. If you relate to them, that is good. I am glad. However, the next show that releases, I don't want there to be an androgynous non-binary person. I want somebody who just looks like a woman or looks like a dude, and they don't use pronouns. That is what I want to see non-binary representation to look like in the future. And I would like to see people who are cis who just look androgynous. If we did have a Double Trouble or an Envy from Full Metal Alchemist, and they did use like he or she pronouns, like that's also good. You need to expand the box both ways. Double Trouble, as far as non-binary representation goes, Double Trouble is gonna age like milk. We'll look back at it and be like, ugh, it was androgynous. What is it? And that's just not the point. I know this video wasn't particularly positive, but I did want to put my complaint with Double Trouble into words, because while I generally do like the character, if it was just a guy or a girl, I think that would be way better than being non-binary. And all the backlash stuff doesn't matter. I do like the character, but I don't feel represented by this in the slightest. Like this video if you like this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.